The birth of a civilization. In the beginning, before stone temples pierced the sky, and before the jungle whispered the name Angkor, there was only water. Endless, shifting, sacred water. The Mekong River, ancient and untamed, wound its way through the heart of Southeast Asia, nourishing forests, deltas, and people who lived by its rhythm, long before they built empires. Here, in the fertile plains and labyrinthine waterways of what is now Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand, the seeds of one of the world's most enduring civilizations were quietly taking root. This was the cradle of the Khmer, not yet an empire, not yet a name, but a people bound to the river, to the monsoon, and to the cycles of life that rose and fell with the flood. Archaeologists now believe that more than 2,000 years ago, long before the first stones of Angkor were carved, small chiefdoms dotted these wetlands. Fishermen, rice cultivators, and traders gathered along the delta's edge, watching sails from India and China drift across the horizon. From this encounter of worlds, the first kingdom emerged, Funan, the dawn kingdom of the Mekong. It was not an empire of warriors, but of water and trade. Its capital, thought to be at Okyo in the delta of southern Vietnam, was a harbor of astonishing vitality, connected by canals that reached far inland. Here, gold and spices from the forests were exchanged for silk, ceramics, and beads from distant lands. And through these maritime routes came ideas, the lifeblood of civilization. From India came the great currents of Hinduism and Buddhism, carried not by conquerors, but by monks, traders, and wanderers. They brought with them new languages, scripts, and myths, stories of gods and cosmic order that would later shape the Khmer soul. Funan's rulers began to style themselves as Chakravartins, universal monarchs, chosen by the gods to rule the earthly realm. Sanskrit inscriptions began to appear on stone, merging local beliefs with the vast cosmology of the subcontinent. Yet, for all its grandeur, Funan was not eternal. By the 6th century, the tide that had raised it began to ebb. The canals silted, the trade winds shifted, and power flowed inland, toward new centers of strength that would bear a different name, Chenla. To the north, in the valleys and plateaus beyond the Mekong, the people of Chenla built upon the foundations Funan had laid. Their rulers were not merchants of the sea, but lords of the land, warriors who unified scattered chiefdoms through marriage/conquest/ and faith. The world was changing. The age of river ports was giving way to the age of kingdoms defined by their temples, their gods, and their monuments to power. Chenla's kings raised sanctuaries to Shiva and Vishnu, carved in sandstone and crowned with lotus spires. For the first time, the distinctive art of the Khmer began to take form, neither wholly Indian nor purely local, but something luminous and new. These were the centuries when the idea of Devaraja, the God King, was born. The sacred union of heaven and earth embodied in a living monarch. To build a temple was not just to honor a deity, it was to shape the universe in stone. But the path from Chenla to Angkor was neither simple nor peaceful. Inscriptions tell of division, of land Chenla and water Chenla, kingdoms that rivaled one another for supremacy, mirroring the duality of the Mekong's own flood and drought. Yet even in this fragmentation, something magnificent was stirring. The Khmer were learning the art of endurance, how to survive through adaptation, to transform weakness into legacy. By the 8th century, as China's Tang Dynasty chroniclers looked southward, they spoke of a land of immense forests and waterways, of rulers who rode elephants adorned with gold, of temples gleaming with bronze. This was a civilization quietly refining itself, not in isolation, but through constant contact with the world. From India, it absorbed philosophy. From China, technology and diplomacy. From the surrounding mountains, the iron and stone that would build an empire. Yet above all, it drew from the land, from the pulse of the Tonle Sap, the great inland lake that swelled and shrank with the monsoon. The Khmer learned to harness this rhythm, building intricate systems of canals and reservoirs, the first whispers of the hydraulic genius that would one day sustain Angkor's vast population. And then, sometime in the 9th century, from this mosaic of kingdoms and cultures, a man rose who would turn faith into foundation, vision into destiny. His name was Jayavarman II. He was not yet the emperor of a vast realm, but he possessed a dream of uniting all the Khmer lands under one banner, sanctified by divine authority. He journeyed from the river plains to the sacred mountain of Phnom Kulen, deep in the heart of the Cambodian jungle. There, in a ceremony described in ancient Sanskrit inscriptions, he declared himself the Devaraja, the God King, the earthly manifestation of Shiva. With that proclamation, history shifted. The Khmer were no longer many, they had become one. The kingdom of Angkor had begun. As the monsoon clouds drifted over the jungle and the rivers swelled once more, Jayavarman's vision took shape in stone. Roads and canals linked distant valleys. Temples rose from the earth like mountains of faith, and the heartbeat of a new empire echoed across the land. What began as a people of rivers and rice had become the architects of one of humanity's most astonishing creations. An empire that would dominate mainland Southeast Asia for centuries. A civilization that would sculpt the jungle itself into an image of paradise. The age of Angkor was dawning. The age of Chenla. The story of Chenla unfolds in the shadow between legend and history, an age where the outlines of the Khmer identity began to emerge from the haze of myth. When the kingdom of Funan waned, its trade routes fading and its canals silting under centuries of monsoon rain, the center of gravity shifted northward, to the valleys and plateaus beyond the Mekong. Here, among mist-covered hills and dense forests, arose the successors of Funan, the kingdom of Chenla. They were heirs not of the sea but of the land, a people whose strength flowed not from commerce but from conquest, and whose kings would become the first to weave the scattered chiefdoms of the interior into the fabric of a single Khmer realm. The chronicles of the Tang dynasty speak of Chenla as a kingdom of elephant lords and forest wealth. Its people were skilled in rice cultivation and ironwork. Its rulers adorned themselves with gold and silk and built shrines to Hindu gods whose names were now spoken in the Khmer tongue. Sanskrit inscriptions carved into stone, the first true Khmer monuments, tell of kings like Bhavavarman and Mahendravarman, men who claimed descent from gods and ruled through divine sanction. In their time, the idea of sacred kingship, the fusion of religion and state, began to take root in the Khmer imagination. No longer were temples merely houses of worship, they became cosmic diagrams, architectural embodiments of heaven on earth. The king's palace mirrored Mount Meru, the cosmic center of the universe, and the land itself was seen as the body of the God King. To cultivate it was to serve the divine. Chenla's rulers inherited Funan's connections to India, but they reshaped them into something uniquely Khmer. In art, architecture, and ritual, they forged a new visual language, powerful, austere, deeply symbolic. The soft sandstone of Cambodia's mountains became their canvas. Temples rose along riverbanks and hilltops, adorned with carvings of deities whose forms blended human and divine. The sculptures of this age, though smaller than those that would come later, already bore the serenity and balance that would define Khmer art for centuries. The calm smile of the Buddha, the poised stillness of Shiva, the dancing grace of Apsaras who seemed to hover between earth and sky. But the realm of Chenla, like the rivers that sustained it, was never still. Over time it fractured, one branch dominating the uplands, the other the lowland river plains. Chinese historians called them Land Chenla and Water Chenla. The first was rugged and martial, the second prosperous and refined, fed by fertile floodplains and temple cities. Yet even divided, both carried forward the same dream: to create order from the chaos of the world, to draw power from the sacred geometry of the cosmos. The belief in Devaraja, the God King, deepened. The king was both sovereign and priest, his reign a reflection of cosmic harmony. To build was to reaffirm that harmony. To neglect it was to invite decline. As the centuries passed, Chenla's influence spread across the Mekong Basin, touching what is now Laos, Thailand, and southern Vietnam. Its armies rode elephants into battle, its priests wrote in Sanskrit and Khmer. Its sculptors carved the first prototypes of the towers that would later define Angkor. Yet behind its cultural brilliance, the kingdom was fragile. The endless oscillation between unity and division eroded its strength. By the early 9th century, Chenla's political cohesion had faded, its lands fragmented under local warlords and rival dynasties. But history, as ever, was preparing a turning point. Amid the ruins of Chenla's fading power, one man, Jayavarman II, would gather the fragments of the old order and forge them into a new one. From the ashes of Chenla, the Khmer Empire would rise. The ceremony that sealed this transformation took place upon a sacred mountain, Phnom Kulen, the Mountain of the Lychees, shrouded in mist and legend. There, around the year 802, Jayavarman II proclaimed himself Chakravartin, the universal monarch, and Devaraja, the living embodiment of the god Shiva. The age of the God King had truly begun. From this act of divine kingship, a new era of Khmer civilization was born, one that would leave behind the fragile kingdoms of the past and construct in their place a vision of eternity in stone and water. The story of Chenla, therefore, is not a tale of decline, but of preparation. It was the chrysalis from which Angkor would emerge, a civilization that would redefine the limits of what humanity could build, believe, and remember. The rise of Angkor. The birth of Angkor was not a single moment, but a slow awakening, a convergence of faith, ingenuity, and ambition that turned jungle into empire. Jayavarman II, having declared divine sovereignty, began a program of expansion and centralization that would unify the Khmer lands under his rule. He moved his court across the plains and river valleys, seeking a site that embodied both spiritual and strategic perfection. Eventually, near the northern edge of the great Tonle Sap Lake, he found it. A fertile basin nourished by seasonal floods, framed by mountains sacred to the gods, and positioned at the heart of the old Chenla world. Here he established the first capital of the empire, Hariharalaya, the city of Harihara, a deity who united Shiva and Vishnu in one form. From this city would spring the line of kings who built Angkor. The genius of the Khmer lay not only in their architecture, but in their understanding of water, the source of life and power in a land ruled by the monsoon. To master the floods of the Mekong and the Tonle Sap was to master destiny itself. Under Jayavarman's successors, the Khmer developed a network of canals, reservoirs, and embankments that turned the plains into a living engine of abundance. These barais, vast man-made lakes, were both practical and symbolic, reservoirs of irrigation and reflections of the cosmic ocean that encircled Mount Meru. The greatest of them, the East Barai, would later stretch nearly 8 kilometers across, an ocean within the jungle, mirroring the heavens. As the empire grew, so too did its capital. New temples rose in ever grander forms: Preah Ko, Bakong, Lolei, sanctuaries built in brick and sandstone, aligned with the stars and the cardinal directions. Each temple was both shrine and state, its towers symbolizing the axis of the universe, its galleries echoing the order of creation. To walk through them was to move through a vision of the cosmos, carved in miniature from the chaos of the earth. The Khmer were sculpting theology into geography, transforming their landscape into a reflection of divine order. By the 10th century, the empire had entered its classical age. The kings of Angkor ruled territories stretching from the Mekong Delta to the mountains of Laos and Thailand. They established diplomatic relations with China and traded gold, ivory, and spices across the seas. But their true ambition lay not in commerce, but in eternity. The monuments of Angkor were not meant merely to impress contemporaries. They were built to speak to the gods. The temples of this period grew more refined, their architecture more complex, their sculptures more serene. Sandstone replaced brick, towers multiplied, each representing a mountain of the gods. Hinduism flourished, but Buddhism too found its place, interweaving into the spiritual tapestry of the Khmer mind. The empire's prosperity allowed artisans to devote entire lifetimes to the perfection of a single temple, a single sculpture, a single carving. It was an age of faith expressed through geometry, and geometry elevated to devotion. Then came the reign of a visionary king, Jayavarman II. His name would become inseparable from the most magnificent temple ever built by human hands, Angkor Wat. The Empire Ascends. Jayavarman II ascended the throne in the early 12th century, a time when the Khmer Empire stood unrivaled in Southeast Asia. Through diplomacy, conquest, and divine charisma, he extended its borders from the shores of the South China Sea to the plains of Burma. But his greatest legacy was not carved in conquest, but in stone. The construction of Angkor Wat, the temple that would come to define not only an empire, but a civilization. Rising from the earth like a lotus blooming from the floodplain, Angkor Wat was both a temple and a universe. It was dedicated to Vishnu, the preserver, and designed as a vast mandala, a cosmic map linking the human world with the divine. Its 5 towers symbolized the peaks of Mount Meru. Its galleries represented the surrounding mountain ranges. Its moat mirrored the primordial ocean. Every corridor was a journey through time and myth. Every bas-relief a scripture in stone. Thousands of artisans labored over its surfaces, carving scenes from the Mahabharata and Ramayana, celestial dancers, kings in procession, and battles between gods and demons. When sunlight touched its spires at dawn, the entire temple blazed like gold. But Angkor Wat was more than an architectural triumph. It was an assertion of faith and order. Its construction required a mastery of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that remains astonishing even today. The alignment of its axis to the rising sun on the spring equinox reveals a civilization that measured not only the land, but the cosmos. It embodied the Khmer belief that the king, as divine ruler, was both the guardian of earthly prosperity and the intermediary between men and gods. Angkor Wat was his temple, his tomb, and his testament, a message to eternity. Under Jayavarman's reign, Angkor reached a level of sophistication unseen elsewhere in the medieval world. Roads radiated from the capital in every direction. Bridges spanned rivers with balustrades carved as Naga serpents. Reservoirs shimmered like inland seas. The empire's wealth was drawn from its mastery of water, a system of irrigation and rice cultivation that sustained millions. The fields of Angkor were not merely fertile, they were rhythmic, pulsing with the cycle of the monsoon like the heartbeat of the empire itself. In these rhythms, the Khmer found balance between earth and sky, order and chaos, king and cosmos. And yet, even at its height, Angkor was not untouched by impermanence. Beyond its borders, new powers stirred. The Cham of central Vietnam, the Thai kingdoms to the north, and distant China, whose dynasties rose and fell with their own tides of fortune. The Khmer Empire stood at the crossroads of cultures, its wealth attracting both admiration and envy. In 1177, its grandeur was shaken when Cham invaders sailed up the Mekong and sacked Angkor itself. For the first time in centuries, the divine city fell silent. But from its ashes would rise the greatest of all Khmer kings, Jayavarman VII, the monarch who would rebuild not only Angkor, but the very idea of what it meant to rule. The reign of Jayavarman VII. When Jayavarman VII ascended the throne, the empire lay wounded, its temples scarred, its pride broken. Yet from this ruin emerged a new vision, one rooted not in conquest, but in compassion. Jayavarman, a devout Mahayana Buddhist, saw kingship as a sacred duty to alleviate suffering. He rebuilt Angkor as both a city of gods and a city of men. His reign marked the empire's zenith, a fusion of power, spirituality, and humanism unmatched in its time. He began with the walls. The new city of Angkor Thom rose upon the old foundations, encircled by massive gates crowned with serene faces gazing toward the four directions. The faces of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, whose smile came to symbolize the soul of the Khmer Empire. At its heart stood the Bayon, a temple unlike any before it. Where Angkor Wat reached toward the heavens, the Bayon turned inward, a labyrinth of towers, galleries, and corridors, each wall carved with scenes of daily life, war, and myth. Here, the divine and the human intertwined. Fishermen casting nets, soldiers marching, kings meditating. The faces of stone looked upon them all, timeless and tranquil, as if the universe itself were watching. Jayavarman's vision extended beyond temples. He built hospitals, rest houses, and roads across his realm, a network of compassion stretching thousands of kilometers. Inscriptions from his reign speak not of glory, but of empathy. The suffering of the people, he wrote, was his own suffering. Under his rule, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, its influence radiating across mainland Southeast Asia. Yet even as it flourished, the seeds of decline were being sown. The vast hydraulic system that sustained Angkor required constant maintenance. The devotion of its people depended on prosperity. As the centuries turned, both began to falter. But for a time, under Jayavarman VII, Angkor was the beating heart of the world, a place where stone, water, and spirit became one. And when his reign ended, he left behind not only monuments of stone, but an idea that greatness is not measured by conquest, but by the compassion a ruler bears for his people. Decline in the jungle. When the sun set on Jayavarman VII's reign, it cast long shadows over an empire that had stretched farther and lasted longer than any in Southeast Asia's history. The monuments gleamed in the tropical light. The reservoirs still shimmered with the reflection of heaven. But something unseen was shifting beneath the surface. The Khmer Empire, built on divine order and human ambition, began to turn inward, its heart weighed down by the very splendor it had created. What had once been a machine of faith and agriculture, perfectly tuned to the rhythm of the monsoon, began to strain against the slow, inexorable pressure of time. The decline of Angkor was not sudden, nor was it simple. Like all great civilizations, it eroded from many directions at once. Centuries of hydraulic mastery required endless labor. Canals silted, reservoirs cracked under the weight of neglect. The jungle, relentless, patient, eternal, began to creep back into the spaces once tamed by man. The same monsoon rains that had nourished the empire now brought floods and disease. In the dry seasons, droughts parched the rice fields. Scholars today see in the climate records of the 14th century signs of catastrophe. Decades of erratic rainfall, followed by an unprecedented drought that may have lasted a generation. For an empire whose lifeblood was water, it was as if the gods themselves had withdrawn their blessing. Yet it was not only nature that conspired against Angkor. New powers were rising beyond its frontiers. To the west, the Thai kingdoms, Sukhothai and later Ayutthaya, emerged as formidable rivals, their armies disciplined, their trade routes rich. To the east, Champa and Dai Viet pressed their borders. Once, the Khmer had ruled through divine charisma. Now they faced the pragmatism of younger, hungrier states. The shifting trade of the Indian Ocean compounded the crisis. Maritime commerce increasingly bypassed the inland routes of the Mekong, favoring coastal ports. The world was changing, and Angkor, magnificent but landlocked, began to lose its connection to that world. Religion, too, transformed. The serene faces of Avalokiteshvara, carved under Jayavarman VII, gradually gave way to the stern symmetry of Hindu deities as later kings sought to restore the old order. Temples that once echoed with Buddhist chants were reconsecrated to Shiva or Vishnu. Statues of the Buddha were hidden, buried, or recarved into Hindu forms. The empire's spirit seemed to oscillate between faiths, unsure whether to look inward for enlightenment or upward for divine favor. The unity that had bound the Khmer for centuries began to fray. The 14th and 15th centuries brought turmoil. Chroniclers speak of internal rebellion, shifting alliances, and a creeping sense of abandonment. The colossal reservoirs that had once gleamed like oceans fell dry. Their embankments cracked, their channels filled with reeds. In some years, the floods returned too fiercely, drowning entire villages. In others, the rain failed, leaving the earth cracked and barren. The delicate balance that had sustained Angkor's greatness between water and land, faith and labor, king and cosmos, was broken. And then came the wars. Ayutthaya's armies, rising from the Chao Phraya Basin, struck deep into Khmer territory. By 1431, they reached Angkor itself. The great city that had once been the center of the world was plundered. The treasures of its temples were carried away, its artisans enslaved, its sacred fires extinguished. Though Angkor would never again serve as the Khmer capital, its people did not vanish. They withdrew southward, toward Phnom Penh and the Mekong Delta, where trade routes still pulsed with life. There, a smaller, humbler kingdom continued, Khmer in spirit, though diminished in scale. Nature closed the circle. As the centuries passed, vines wrapped themselves around the towers, roots split the stone, and the jungle swallowed the city. The moats became ponds, the ponds became swamps, and the swamps became forest. Yet within that silence, Angkor endured, untouched, unbroken, waiting. For 400 years, the world forgot the empire that had once built mountains of faith from the mud of the plains. But history, like the jungle, never truly sleeps. The Rediscovery. When the European explorers of the 19th century arrived in Cambodia, they did not expect to find a city that defied imagination. The French naturalist Henri Mouhot, journeying through the dense forests of Siem Reap in 1860, stumbled upon a vision that would astonish the world. Through tangled vines and colossal roots, he saw towers rising like stone lotuses, walls covered with carvings of gods, and corridors stretching into shadow. One of the grandest monuments ever conceived by the human mind, he wrote, awed, trembling. To him, it was as though he had found a lost world, a city built by giants and abandoned to time. But Angkor had never been truly lost. The Khmer people who lived nearby still visited its temples, still offered incense, still whispered prayers in the ancient tongue. To them, these ruins were not relics, but ancestors. Yet to the world beyond, Mouhot's discovery was a revelation. The West, steeped in its own colonial confidence, could scarcely comprehend that such architecture, such mathematical precision, such artistry could have arisen in the heart of tropical Asia 1,000 years before. Scholars, artists, and archaeologists soon followed, members of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, clearing the jungle, cataloging inscriptions, sketching the bas-reliefs, and restoring the fallen towers stone by stone. For decades, Angkor became both a mystery and a mirror, a symbol of Southeast Asia's forgotten grandeur and of the world's growing fascination with the past. The explorers spoke of a lost civilization, but the truth was more complex. The Khmer had not vanished, they had transformed. Their language, their faith, their identity had endured in the villages that dotted the floodplains, in the chants of monks, in the dances of apsaras still performed at harvest festivals. Angkor was not a ruin so much as a memory, living, breathing, waiting to be seen again. The 20th century brought both wonder and tragedy. The site became a beacon of national pride, its silhouette emblazoned on the flag of Cambodia, a symbol of continuity across centuries. Yet the same nation would endure colonization, war, and unimaginable suffering. During the dark years of the Khmer Rouge, Angkor stood silent again, its stones witnessing horror and survival. But even in those years of despair, the temples remained, serene, eternal, untouched by ideology, as if reminding the people that their history stretched far beyond the reach of any tyrant. When peace returned, so too did restoration. Archaeologists, historians, and conservators from across the world joined Cambodian experts to preserve Angkor's fragile majesty. Laser scans mapped its every tower. Satellites traced the ghostly outlines of its ancient reservoirs. What emerged was a revelation. Angkor had not been a single city, but a vast urban network, the largest pre-industrial metropolis on Earth. Its canals stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Its population may have numbered 1 million. Far from being swallowed by the jungle, It had once tamed it, transformed it into the living geometry of an empire. Today, millions walk the causeways that once bore kings and priests. They watch the sunrise over Angkor Wat, its reflection rippling in the lotus ponds, its silhouette shimmering in gold. The jungle hums around them, the air thick with history and incense. Every carving, every crack, every vine that wraps around the stone speaks of a civilization that refused to vanish. Legacy and eternity. The story of the Khmer Empire does not end in ruin. It lives in the rhythm of the Mekong, in the prayers of monks, in the laughter of children playing among ancient stones. It lives in the face of every Cambodian who looks upon Angkor and sees not a relic, but a reminder that their ancestors once built eternity from earth and faith. Angkor's legacy reaches beyond borders and centuries. Its architecture influenced temples from Thailand to Laos, from Vietnam to Java. Its art shaped the aesthetics of an entire region. Its irrigation systems, rediscovered by modern engineers, reveal an ecological wisdom long before its time. But perhaps its greatest inheritance is philosophical. The Khmer understanding that power, faith, and nature are bound together, that to rule justly is to live in balance with the world. In Angkor Wat's bas-reliefs, one can still read that philosophy. The gods and demons who churn the ocean of milk are not merely myth, they are symbols of creation and destruction, of struggle and renewal. In that eternal churning, the Khmer saw the cycle of all things: empires, rivers, lives. Nothing endures unchanged, yet nothing is truly lost. Today, as dawn breaks over the towers of Angkor, the same sun that once rose upon kings now illuminates a living nation. The air smells of lotus and earth, the chants of monks drift through the trees, and the jungle glows green with rebirth. The city that the jungle swallowed has returned, not as a capital of power, but as a temple of memory, a bridge between the human and the divine, between past and future. To stand before Angkor Wat is to feel time collapse. You see in its symmetry the intellect of mathematicians, in its carvings the devotion of artists, in its endurance the faith of a people who believed the divine could be built by mortal hands. It reminds us that civilization, for all its grandeur and fragility, is an act of belief. Belief that order can rise from chaos, that beauty can transcend decay, that memory itself can defy oblivion. The Khmer Empire may have fallen, its kings and wars forgotten by centuries of reign, but its spirit remains, etched in stone, whispered by trees, reflected in water. It stands as both warning and wonder, that all empires fade, yet the human desire to create, to reach for the eternal, endures. And as the last light fades over the jungle, the towers of Angkor glow softly in the dusk, golden, silent, eternal. A civilization once lost to the world now watches over it, whispering through the centuries a truth older than time itself. Nothing built in faith is ever truly lost.